Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Beckman in here for New Focus Recordings, and today we're talking to Bonnie Whiting, who put out an incredible album of music for speaking percussionists called Perishable Structures with us back in August, featuring music written by Bonnie herself, Frederick Rzewski, Vinko Globokar, Richard Logan Green, and Susan Krenty. Her album explores the role of narrative and storytelling in music and the interaction of speech and text with music, which are ideas that have a long history in the percussion repertoire and is an area that Bonnie has done extensive work in throughout the years. So thank you so much for joining us, Bonnie.
Thank you so much for talking, Neil. This is great.
Of course, yeah. So, first off, can you talk a little bit about your background with speaking percussionist music in general?
Sure, absolutely. I think the Globocar piece was actually the first piece of speaking percussionist music I ever played. I learned it for the first time way back in 2002 and was drawn to that piece in particular just because I was a student of French and was
Mm,
very much into this idea of practicing um, practicing this language in a musical context. And in terms of deciding that this was going to be a main focus of my career, in terms of being a speaking percussionist, um, that actually came from my years of work with a group that performed new music integrated with dance, narrative, and theater for primarily children and family audiences. It
oh,
was this
cool.
group called Tales and Scales that, you know, existed as a full-time touring chamber music quartet for about 25 years, and I joined them for 3 of those years. And it was just this incredible learning on my feet kind of experience of playing 200 shows a year where you're also moving and speaking and acting. And so after my time with that group, I got super into just commissioning pieces for speaking percussionist and making some of my own and seeing what else existed in the repertoire.
Oh, yeah, that's incredible. 200 shows a year is that's a very demanding schedule.
It was crazy. It was amazing. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't do
so,
that anymore.
sure, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So then, how did this album specifically come about?
I would say, and this is my second album. My first album was also a bunch of speaking percussionist music, um, featuring John Cage's
Mhm.
pieces that could be made for speaking or singing percussionist. This one felt more like if there was to be my own personal greatest hits or the pieces that I feel have become most integral to my own repertoire that I like playing over and over again. It's kind of like a bucket list album for me, if you will,
Mhm.
um, in the sense that I had these pieces, some of them like the Globocar that I've been playing for more than a decade, and I really wanted the opportunity to preserve them in a way. So that's what I was thinking. And I guess if I had to think of a theme for the entire album, it would be that of translation. Sometimes the translation of musical sound to spoken word, or in the case of Richard Logan Green's piece, the translation of this, electronic tape part to acoustic only instruments, um, or this idea, even in a way, in the Globocar, this translation of, what does it mean if you're not a native speaker and you're hearing French, you know, for in this musical context. So, thinking a lot about text and translation, and just these pieces that I feel like uh, I grew up with as a musician.
Mhm. Yeah, and that idea of translation goes very well into your piece that starts the album, where you took personal letters from Varese and set them using a snare drum and both highlighting some of the words and also just the nature of the snare drum being the loud instrument that it is. Oftentimes, the words are covered by the snare drum, um, kind of getting to the idea of Varese's intelligent sounds and seeming to take away the meaning from the words themselves and trying to have them exist as just sounds themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a funny story that about a week ago I did a virtual album launch concert. It was my first ever truly live streamed concert in the sense that
Mm,
I was playing by myself in a concert hall, um, not presenting edited, pre recorded material.
right.
And I told myself, oh, there's one little spot where I actually am inserting something pre recorded. So I'll go check in on the live stream chat. And what I found was that a whole bunch of people had written in to complain that the snare drum sometimes was covering the voice in the Varese piece, and I realized, oh, that's my fault. I didn't quite explain that. Yeah, sometimes the snare drum is quite literally um, playing rhythms that are partially generated by speech
Mhm.
patterns, and it is supposed to be this kind of all-consuming wave where sometimes the snare drums will cover the voice.
Yeah, and in the album liner notes, he talked about that it was a reflection on speech patterns rather than trying to necessarily like kind of like some of like especially the Globicar where it is you're literally playing the rhythm of the words that you're speaking. Um, so yeah, having that same kind of just like a continuum of how literally you're following the speech patterns versus just kind of, as you say, reflecting on them.
Right, exactly. So there's this idea that it's connotative rather than
Hmm.
denotative. I'm not even necessarily always trying to tell you exactly what
Right.
Varese was saying, because in many ways his music does that for him, and certainly his writings and letters. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go ahead and listen to an excerpt of the piece. This is about the first minute of her piece, Perishable Structures That Would Be Social Events. And this is the fourth movement titled Varese.
Today, with the technical means that exist, what I call zones of intensities, frequencies will extend the limits of Earth's that is their oxygenation, not only will the be revealed in all their splendor an entirely new magic of sound.
All right, so that was the first minute of Bonnie's piece, Perishable Structures That Would Be Social Events. And so the next piece is one of the classics of the speaking percussionist repertoire, Frederick Chebsky's To the Earth. So can you talk about your history of that piece?
Absolutely. This was one of these pieces that I started learning when I was on the road with that group, Tails and Scales. And I wanted to learn it in part because I knew we had a tour because we were driving from the Midwest to the West Coast, and we didn't want to drive all the way back. We had something like 4 days where we weren't, we didn't have shows, and we were just hanging out near Custer National Park. It was gorgeous, and I needed something that I could practice in our little hotel room, that I could fit in the tour van, and the flower pots for Frederick's piece seemed just perfect. So I will never forget, spending 4 days getting to know that piece for the first time, in a beautiful part of the world. And later that year, I guess that must have been 2006, I had the opportunity to play it for Frederick. And I don't remember if I mentioned this in the liner notes, but something kind of fun and interesting about that first meeting with him was I showed up just at the dress rehearsal on stage with something like, I don't know, between 12 and 18 flower pots, thinking that what he was going to want to do was kind of like adjust all of them and decide, what the best ones were. But he didn't. In fact, he refused to weigh in at all
Oh, wow.
on the sound, saying it was up to me. And that, in fact, that's not what the piece is about. That you could theoretically make this with any four terracotta flower pots. Um, and it was wonderful to just to work with him and to have his engagement with the piece. I do some things a little bit differently at the end with his blessing. I actually put down the beaters at the end, and I stop playing with the beaters and only use my hands to kind of create this intimacy. I do a little bit of singing at a point in the piece, and I feel like all of these meaningful deviations from the score were things that Frederick kind of approved and was happy with. But mostly with that piece, I just felt so lucky to bring this with me to a lot of places around the country and in the world, because it is such an incredibly portable, um, easy to set up, tactile, accessible kind of piece of music.
Yeah, and it does strike me as such an intimate piece of music, using flower pots that so many people have such easy access to, and only the four pitches. And you do hear the clarity of the text, I think, clearest in this piece rather than everything else, to where it almost does seem like a more traditional, almost song and accompaniment type thing, to where like the emphasis really is put on this ritualistic text from 500 BC or around there.
Right.
Yes, really gorgeous
Yeah,
piece. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, so moving on to the Globicar, which is the next piece on the album, definitely treats text and its percussion accompaniment in much more virtuosic ways. Like you said, it is dealing in French, so it's taking Bertolt Brecht's. I'm blanking on the
The
title.
Life of Galileo.
Life of
Brecht's
Galileo.
Life of Galileo, yeah.
Yeah, so French setting of that. So it is like a narrative play in the same style of Brecht's learning plays, but it's just six fragments given out of order. So kind of the idea of narrative is blown up.
Yeah. And it's one of these interesting things that over the not quite, but almost 20 years of playing this piece, I've done really different things as I try to shepherd an audience through this experience. Um, when I was first performing it, it was very clear that what I had to do was give a synopsis of what was happening in these scenes and kind of move them around and contextualize them so that the audience could understand, okay, this is happening now, and then this happens, and this is out of order. Um, but gradually, the more I was living with this piece, the more I realized that it's much more just about understanding the theatricality inherent in the music itself. And I actually had this wonderful experience in Oslo, actually, in, oh my gosh, it wasn't early February. It was right before
Oh
everything
wow.
just shut down. It was like the last thing I did, where I was playing the piece for a whole bunch of students at the Norwegian Academy of Music, and was thinking about, okay, how am I going to go into the spiel for them? What's their context for this piece? And one of the students, who was an undergraduate, just immediately said, well, the music itself is enough. You don't have to talk so much about the theater. And I thought that was very beautiful, actually, his
Right.
his insight on that.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you usually give audiences the text to this? Because I've heard the piece a couple of times and I've never actually seen the French text. But whenever I hear it performed, I'm always like, oh, I can basically tell at least like the moods of the different characters and like the interactions between them. Even though I did take a semester of French, none of it really stuck. But in your performance too, you do get an idea of the 13 different characters, I believe it is, and their interactions, both. Even if you were a French speaker, sometimes we hear exactly what they're saying, and then there are a couple of movements where we aren't given the words at all, and it goes entirely through percussion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never given something almost like a libretto or something
Right.
like that. I've never done that. I certainly have done a synopsis. I'll sometimes just read these kind of poetic limericks, which I think I
Mm-hmm.
have here in the liner notes, which I grabbed in case I needed them. Sometimes I'll give just a few of these limericks that
Mm-hmm.
separate the scenes. That these beautiful things that Brecht made only for his American version of the play. He had
Interesting.
kind of like a more English version,
Right.
and there's a version, in the original, I think in German. There's this version, I think, in French that I don't think Brecht translated that. I think Globicar did.
Mm.
But there are a couple of these wonderful limericks that he has. The first one: in the year 1609, science's light began to shine. Galileo set out to prove the sun is still, it's the earth that moves. Um, sort of like that. These kind of playful,
Right.
almost a synopsis in a limerick form. And I have even sometimes, with apologies to Mr. Globicar, done this thing where I actually translate the stage directions into English, or
Sure.
and
Yep.
give these English limericks to kind of shepherd an audience through. And I was lucky to work with Vinko Globicar in, I think it was 2014, at a festival, and gave a talk on two of his pieces, on this piece and his piece Corporel, and also performed for him. And even better than that, had the opportunity to share some meals and conversation.
Oh, wow.
And I asked him, what do you think about people who engage in a little bit of translation, to kind of shepherd an audience through when you're dealing with, you know, people whose vernacular language is not being spoken. And he said, no, that's not what it's about. So
Hmm.
he pretty clearly weighed in on that. So while maybe a few recordings exist of me adding some English and some limericks, you know, I think his preference for sure is that it stays in the original because okay, and I know I'm talking too much here.
No, please.
There are these really interesting moments, right? And maybe if you remember from your experience as a student of French, there are some words that are very hard um, to pronounce. If you're a non-native
Yes,
speaker.
definitely.
So I'm thinking about tous, tous, and tu, the informal
Hmm.
you, right? tous versus tu. And for me in my setup, this tu is this kind of lower conga sound that I have, and it's open tu tu, and I kind of feel that resonance in my body. And then one of the higher sounds that I have is tu, this very closed sound
Hmm.
that I do on a small rototom, tu tu. So the score itself becomes almost a pedagogical tool for helping me to be a
Sure.
better
Yeah.
French speaker. And like, I'm sure I could find a corresponding way to do that in English, right? And I'm just going to commission a friend to help me to do that. I don't need Globacar's seminal work, Touche, to do
Sure.
that for me. Because it is the first, when we think about this ever expanding canon of music for speaking percussionists, this is what we think of as the first piece in the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in your other projects too, it looks like you have a couple duos for speaking percussionist, which I don't think I'd ever heard of any duo speaking percussionist. I think I'd only ever seen that as being a solo work.
Yeah, absolutely. I play a lot with Jen Torrance, who's an American percussionist based in Norway now, and we're working on commissioning things all the time. There are a few other like trios for speaking
Oh
percussionists that
wow!
I've seen, or more theatrical things.
Right.
If you go back, even to thinking of like Trio Le Cercle and these like Apergeese pieces, that kind of a thing. Yeah, there's a lot of work for percussion trio where there's some speaking or even some like percussion theater happening.
Well,
Uh,
certainly with a group like Percussion Group Cincinnati,
yes.
in their trio, know they did a lot of theatrical stuff. And speaking of, Alan Oddie, one of the members of Percussion Group Cincinnati, produced your album. And we have a mutual connection there. We both went to
Right.
CCM
I
for
think you
the
were in his Eurythmics class, right? I mean,
oh,
that's
yes,
quintessential Alan Oddie right there.
yeah.
Can't get that anywhere else.
It was yeah, such an incredible experience. I don't know. Did you take his Eurythmics class?
I actually ended up taking it twice because I
Oh,
started my
incredible.
master's at CCM. I
Hmm.
did it for a year, and then I got that job touring with the
Hmm.
group that did music for children and family audiences. And I left for like 5 years. Finally, came back to finish the degree, and when I came back, I could take the Eurythmics class again. So
Oh,
I
that's
had it
incredible.
twice, and it was just so great.
Yeah, I
So
don't. Yeah, when I took it, it was about half Tai Chi and half more straightforward Eurythmics, and
absolutely.
it was at like 9 in the morning. It was just the perfect way to start a day. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about your experience working with him on the album?
Yeah, I mean, he is someone who I feel so lucky that in addition, to the fact that he was my teacher for a long time, we also have collaborated together as a duo. So we've played together throughout the country, in New Zealand, at the Percussive Arts Society international conventions throughout the years. And he's someone who I just totally trust as having uh, the most perfect concept of sound.
Sure, right.
He's if I could find anyone in the world who I think knows how to make beautiful sounds and instruments, it's Alan. He's also, I don't know if you had this experience, incredibly honest. He
Hmm.
will tell me if I sound like shit. I don't know if I can say that
That's totally
nicely.
fine. Yeah,
It's totally fine. He has walked into a room and said that sounds like shit, lovingly, of course.
of course.
Um, and is someone who is intimately familiar with this rep.
Hmm.
So I trusted him 100% to listen to this objectively and help me to make decisions, about balance and text audibility and that kind of a thing. And yeah, it's been really, really wonderful. And then I was so grateful. I was writing the liner notes and sending, it's like, what do you think about this? And he said, well, what about this? And he started writing and writing. And I realized, you know what, why don't I just let you say something, what you want to say, and then I'll say my part. So he has a really wonderful introduction to the liner notes that you could look at if you haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. You mentioned some essays from Walter Benjamin about storytelling, which I definitely need to go back and read. Sounds really interesting. Yeah, so plowing ahead on the album, next piece is by Richard Logan Green. And so this is the only piece that doesn't feature you speaking, but does still use that same concept of translation, to where there's no physical score for this. We just have an audible score to, so basically, I was wondering about this. So do you actually hear the audible score as you're playing it, or do you just do that beforehand and then kind of set up your interpretation?
That's a great question. Richard was really explicit that he did not want me listening to the audible score while I was playing it. And in fact, even in subsequent performances, since I did the tracking for the album, it's kind of expanded a bit or contracted in some places to deviate from what some of the exact temporal limitations that are imposed by that audible score. So no, I don't usually I've never listened to it while playing. I did make for myself a bit of, some notes just and lose timing so that I didn't get lost in a certain section and come back. I was trying to be challenged to replicate the sounds as closely as possible in an acoustic percussion context. But no, he actually doesn't ever want it to be this piece to be, the electronic part to be played on its own. He doesn't see that as a standalone composition, and he doesn't want me to listen while I play.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're going to listen to an excerpt of that. And so we're going to play side by side two little snippets of the score that he presented. And then we're going to play about the first 2 minutes or so of Bonnie's realization of that. So here's Richard Logan Green's Your Thoughts While Listening. So that was both a little bit of Richard Logan's Green score to the piece and a little bit of Bonnie's realization of the piece. So from the excerpts that you sent, it's just a couple electronically created sounds. Is that basically what it is for the whole score?
Yeah, I mean, there are the sounds expand and change a little bit. There's some super complicated bass sounds. I have no idea what they are,
Is
how
that
to
the
use it.
section where you're doing a lot of things on the bass drum in your realization?
The entire piece basically takes place on a giant concert bass drum.
Hmm,
And I've clamped various things to it.
sure.
Sometimes I'm playing on the shell. I've got some chains. I got some marbles. I actually have a thunder tube. There's one of these, like it's a kid's toy to make thunder that I've clamped to the side of the
Right.
bass drum. And so the thought is that the bass drum itself is a resonating chamber for
Mm.
just all of these extended techniques. In part because there were all of these complicated bass sounds that came in later that I just, to me, it didn't feel like it was going to be this massive setup piece. It felt like it had to be a bunch of small sounds extended through one resonant instrument. But, a student was asking me about it last week after I did this live stream, and I said, well, I'll send you the electronic score. I'll bet you would make something really different. And
Mhm.
I hope that happens. I hope more people decide to make their own versions of this.
Right, and yeah, that does seem like, especially as a guitarist, like there is a fair amount of rep that asks you to like, you can pick your own instruments or be more creative with the materials you're using. But that certainly seems like one of the most interesting things about being a percussionist is, of course, there are a lot of things where, especially in the orchestral world, it's like you play the snare drum here and here are the exact notes that you play. But there's just so much, especially solo percussionist rep, where it's like, here are like the kind of sounds we want. Pick your instruments, pick how you want to do it, and you can really just be as creative as you want, which just seems like an incredible part of being a percussionist.
Absolutely. It's super fun.
Yeah, cool. And so the last piece on the album is by Susan Krenty, who is mostly a playwright, and I believe this is her only piece for percussion. And it was originally for a percussionist and her as an actor, which later um, she was fine with a single person performing it. So this does seem like the most straightforwardly theatrical of the pieces to me, um, to where it starts off with basically being on one end of a telephone call where you just hear a lot of phrases that make no sense on their own, and the piece like slowly devolves into almost like a manic episode. We hear various like patriotic songs and um, row 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 the row your boat, if I remember right. um, yeah, and it's just such a great piece to close the album with.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she wrote this in the late '80s, and we've talked since then about updating it and making it with making the piece again with different excerpts of different patriotic songs or popular songs or children's songs that would be more relevant, like we were joking about the ubiquity of Disney's Frozen, and
Sure.
that would absolutely be the
Right.
stand-in for the zippity yay my oh my what a wonderful day that you hear in there. Um, and I think part of what this piece is for Susan, and by extension for me, is this idea that there is so much that is lost when we try to communicate by language, especially in a medium like over the phone. Um, and I was thinking a lot about this, in the last few months, where most of us have been
Yep.
stuck at home and doing what you and I are doing right now, and like trying to connect over Zoom with people, and it's like we're misunderstanding context clues, and there are all these new etiquettes that are that are emerging in
Mhm.
terms of engaging in this way. And I think her piece is very prescient in this. And yeah, she does not have much music written for percussion. There might be like one other ensemble piece that has some percussion in it, but I can't even think of what it is. A
Mhm.
couple of us have been pestering her for a snare drum piece
Sure.
recently. But her main work is with this organization called the School for Designing a Society, which is really like a
Mhm.
grassroots social justice organization in Champaign, Urbana, where she lives. She was a Herbert Bruns student.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of, her political consciousness for sure, it, grows out of that kind of study. Um, and, this isn't even something I was able to find the right way to write about in the liner notes, but I absolutely see a real connection between what's happening in, the Globicars piece, especially with its engagement with Brecht and, what's happening in a lot of Susan's music. They're really similar aesthetics, almost similar humor, with a bit more absurdity, which I just
Right.
love.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is delightful absurdity. And I've actually just recently discovered some of those University of Illinois electronic composers. And I was just like, wow, how did I never hear about this like tiny enclave of just like wild musical thinkers?
Yeah, it's like mind blowing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we're going to listen to the final excerpt. This is towards the end of Susan Parenti's piece. Um, which is, let me get the full title. It is Exercise for Hands, Right, Left, and Deserted Mouth. Number 4, Speaking Percussionist in Other Ditties.
No, that wasn't what I meant to say. What I meant to say was there's still some life to the old ta-ta. No, I like you. No, that wasn't. I, like you, have always felt the need to. It was a totally ridiculous evening. I like. You hate. No, this isn't. What's the matter with sympathy? I always try to be honest with people, and if I say I'll do something, I likely sometimes. You let me stick to the spacious skies for agreements I make in the summertime when all the leaves and trees are totally ridiculous evening. And the redbirds sing, I love. Bring your bombs, I'll you, but you don't want my brain.
So that was the last excerpt from the album, from Susan Parenti's piece. So now that the album is out, I know that you're teaching this semester and like all of us just generally surviving.
Right.
But do you have any upcoming projects that you've been working on?
I do, and I'm continuing in the vein of making and commissioning new works for speaking and singing percussionist. And the thing I'm most excited about right now is this extractable cycle of 9 pieces for speaking and singing percussionist called Through the Eyes. And this piece was created in collaboration with composer Eliza Brown and 9 women who happen to be incarcerated in the Indiana Women's Prison. They're Sade Avery, Whitney Coco Bales Malone, Amaris Rose Bunyard, Lara Campbell, Joyce Hawkins, LaDawn Johnson, Marjorie Woods, Ashley Strong, Ingrid Swinford, and Donetta Taylor Shelton. So about a year ago, I had this incredible opportunity to collaborate with these folks in the prison. We had a 14-week residency, and I was there for 2 of those weeks. I left some instruments there when I wasn't going to be there. And basically the women, who had varying degrees of experience in music, some are active practitioners, some engage with traditional notation, some don't, and collaboratively developed these 9 pieces for singing and speaking percussionist that, we planned to premiere actually at the prison this coming November. Due to COVID, we're not necessarily doing that. I'm excited to document that in a high quality video and audio shoot in January for dissemination on streaming platforms like YouTube and some of the more specific streaming services that they have in the prison. So I'm really looking forward to premiering this extractable cycle of pieces because I think it's like a way of taking some of the most flexible and creative tools that we have as experimental musicians in terms of scores and non-traditional techniques and making them available to a wider range of artists who might not normally engage in this kind of medium.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like an incredible project. So thank you so much for talking with me today. So Bonnie's album Perishable Structures is available wherever you like to find your music. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Neil. I really appreciate it. And thanks to New Focus.